In the first weeks of 1942, the streets of Tokyo were a sea of rising sun flags and triumphant shouts of banzai. Victory was an intoxicating perfume in the air. Hong Kong had fallen. Manila had surrendered. The seemingly invincible British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, now lay in watery graves off the coast of Malaya. From the perspective of the average Japanese citizen, the Empire of the Sun was ascendant, destined for a glorious new era. But aboard his flagship Yamato, anchored in the quiet waters of Hashirajima Bay, one man felt no such euphoria. In the heart of the storm of victory, a cold, calculating dread was the only companion to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the hero of the hour. Yet, a spectre haunted him, not a spectre of defeat, but of the very nature of the victory he had just engineered. He understood a terrible truth that the cheering crowds and the chest-thumping generals in Tokyo refused to see. They had not conquered an enemy. They had merely enraged it. There's a famous phrase, often attributed to him, that perfectly captures his sentiment. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. While historians debate whether he ever actually spoke those exact words, the feeling behind them was undeniably real. Yamamoto was a different breed from the fiery nationalistic army commanders. He had not just studied America in books, he had lived it. As a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., from 1926 to 1928, and having studied at Harvard, he had walked its streets. He had seen the endless lines of automobiles pouring out of Detroit's factories. He had witnessed the vast oil fields of Texas. He understood, in a way few in the Japanese high command could, that Japan was a nation of workshops, while America was a nation of continents. To provoke this giant into a total war of attrition was, in his mind, a form of national suicide. His opposition to a full-scale war with the United States had been so public, so vocal, that he was a marked man in his own country. Friends within the Imperial General Staff had urged him to take command of the combined fleet at sea, not just for strategic reasons, but to protect him from the assassin's blades of the ultra-nationalists in Tokyo who saw his caution as weakness, even treason. Now, surrounded by reports of stunning successes, Yamamoto was more worried than ever. His chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, noted the commander's dark mood. In his diary, Ugaki wrote of the need for far-sighted statesmanship, a phrase borrowed directly from his brooding superior. Yamamoto saw an insidious disease spreading through the military and political leadership, the Shori Boy, or victory disease. It was a sickness of arrogance, a belief that the Japanese fighting spirit, the Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material disadvantage. The initial victories, as spectacular as they were, only fed this delusion. They saw an empire stretching its tentacles like a mighty octopus, as he had once predicted to a friend. But Yamamoto saw an octopus stretched too thin, its limbs exposed and vulnerable, its lifeblood draining away with every passing day the war continued. The core of Yamamoto's gamble had never been the conquest of America. He knew that was impossible. His strategy was a lightning strike, a devastating blow designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and, more importantly, shatter American morale. He believed that the soft and incompetent Americans, as the army propagandists loved to call them, would lose the will to fight a long, bloody war across an ocean. He had envisioned a 6-month to 1-year window where Japan could run wild. After that, he warned, America's industrial furnace would be fully stoked, and it would begin to churn out ships, planes, and tanks at a rate Japan could only dream of. The fall of a key strategic point like Singapore, he believed, would be the perfect moment to extend a generous olive branch to negotiate a peace that would secure Japan's new sphere of influence in Asia before the giant was fully awake. But now, just a month in, he could already see his timeline crumbling. The American carriers, the most vital targets at Pearl Harbor, had been at sea and escaped unscathed. They were a constant, menacing threat, a dagger pointed at the heart of his fleet. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor wasn't turning into despair in America. It was forging an iron will for vengeance. The victory disease in Tokyo was making the politicians and army generals greedy. They weren't thinking of peace. They were thinking of what to conquer next. A bitter conflict raged within the Imperial General Headquarters. The army, flush with victory and obsessed with its land campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, wanted to push further, perhaps even into the Soviet Union. They contemptuously vetoed Yamamoto's more radical ideas. One of his favorite plans was a bold thrust into the Indian Ocean. To seize Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, lure out the British Eastern Fleet and annihilate it, then link up with their German allies in the Middle East. It was a grand vision that would secure Japan's oil supply indefinitely. The army flatly refused. Another plan, championed by the Naval General Staff, called for the invasion of Australia. By seizing New Guinea and the island chains of Fiji and Samoa, they could cut America's supply lines and isolate the continent, starving it into submission. It was a slow, grinding plan, the exact opposite of the decisive battle Yamamoto knew he needed. He argued against it fiercely. It would take too long, consume too many resources, and still wouldn't deliver the psychological knockout blow required to stop the Americans. No. Yamamoto needed something else. Something spectacular. Something so audacious it would force President Roosevelt to the negotiating table. He needed to destroy the one weapon that had escaped him at Pearl Harbor, the American aircraft carriers. He needed to lure them into a trap. In his mind, a new plan began to form, a complex and daring operation centered on a tiny, remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific. It was a place few had ever heard of, but soon the world would know its name. He ordered his staff to draft the documents. One was designated the MI Plan, an invasion, and a decisive naval battle off Midway Island. The other, even more ambitious, was the AL Plan, an invasion of the Aleutian Islands, a stepping stone to the North American continent itself. This was his ultimate gamble. He would risk his entire fleet, the pride of the Japanese Navy, on a single throw of the dice. It was a plan born not of confidence, but of a secret, gnawing desperation. He had to end the war, and he had to end it now. Because Isoroku Yamamoto knew, with chilling certainty, that in a long fight, Japan could not possibly win. While Yamamoto was locked in his strategic chess match against his own high command, wrestling with the ghosts of future battles, the sleeping giant he so feared was already stirring. The American response came not with a grand fleet or a massive army, but with a single, audacious act of retaliation. A phantom punch delivered from an impossible distance, a mission born of pure desperation and blistering resolve. On the 18th of April 1942, the air raid sirens, until then a sound reserved for drills and propaganda films, shrieked across Tokyo for real. The citizens, conditioned to believe in the inviolable sanctity of their homeland, looked up in disbelief. Flying low and fast over their rooftops were not Japanese planes, but 16 American B-25 Mitchell bombers lumbering, twin-engine land bombers that had no business being anywhere near Japan. The sight was so illogical, so utterly impossible, that some early reports mistakenly identified them as Japanese planes on training maneuvers. This was the Doolittle Raid. Led by the charismatic Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, it was a mission of almost suicidal bravery. The bombers had accomplished a feat never before thought possible, taking off from the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, hundreds of miles out at sea. They were a one-way ticket. They had enough fuel to reach Japan and, with luck, crash land in friendly territory in China. There was no plan for their return. The physical damage inflicted by their small payload of bombs was negligible. A few factories hit, a handful of civilian casualties. It was a pinprick, but its psychological impact was that of a sledgehammer blow to the very soul of the Japanese Empire. For centuries, the home islands had been considered sacred ground, untouched by foreign invaders. A divine shield, it was believed, protected the land of the emperor. The Doolittle Raid tore that sacred veil to shreds. Bombs fell within a mile of the Imperial Palace, an unthinkable sacrilege. The attack wasn't just an assault on military targets. It was a profound insult to their national pride, a deep scar carved upon the face of the rising Sunday. The public's confusion quickly curdled into panic. and then into a quiet, simmering rage. But within the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, the mood was one of pure, unadulterated humiliation. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the pride of the nation, had made a solemn promise to the Emperor. The homeland would never be touched. They had failed. Admirals and generals, who days before had been basking in the glory of their southern conquests, were now screaming at each other, desperate to assign blame. Where did the planes come from? How did they get through the picket lines of submarines and patrol boats? The failure of intelligence was total. The failure to protect the Emperor was absolute. Into this cauldron of shame and fury stepped Isoroku Yamamoto. This was his moment. He didn't need to shout or pound the table. The 16 American bombers had made his argument for him more eloquently than he ever could. All his dire warnings about American ingenuity and unbreakable will, once dismissed as the pessimistic ramblings of an America sympathizer, now rang with the terrifying clarity of prophecy. The Americans were not going to be intimidated into peace. They were going to fight, and they were going to bring the war to Japan's doorstep, no matter the cost. Suddenly, Yamamoto's obsessive focus on the American carriers was no longer seen as a personal fixation, but as a strategic necessity of the highest order. The Doolittle Raid had proven that the carriers were more than just weapons. They were mobile platforms for vengeance, capable of striking at the heart of the empire itself. The defensive perimeter that the army had been so content with was now revealed to be dangerously inadequate. The debate was over. The need for a decisive action was no longer a matter of opinion. It was a matter of national honor and survival. Yamamoto's Midway plan, once a controversial gamble, was now embraced as the only logical solution. The logic was simple and brutal. To ensure Tokyo never heard the sound of American bombers again, the Japanese defensive line had to be pushed further east. To do that, they had to take Midway Atoll, and to take Midway, they had to draw out and destroy its defenders, the American Pacific Fleet, and its precious, elusive carriers. The Doolittle Raid, conceived by the Americans as a desperate morale boost after a string of humiliating defeats, had an ironic and unforeseen consequence. It handed Isoroku Yamamoto the ultimate justification for his master plan. It unified the divided factions of the Japanese military behind a single, aggressive goal. The humiliation of April 18th had to be avenged, and the threat of a repeat performance had to be eliminated forever. The orders were swiftly approved. Operation MI, the invasion of Midway, was set in motion. To support it, and to create a strategic diversion, Operation AL, the attack on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, was also green-lit. The die was cast. In the naval yards of Kure and Yokosuka, the final preparations began. The greatest naval armada the world had ever seen was about to assemble a fleet of over 200 ships, including 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. It was a force of overwhelming power, designed to crush the remnants of the American fleet in one final, apocalyptic battle. Yamamoto finally had his wish. He was about to set a trap for the American carriers, confident that his superior numbers and the skill of his veteran pilots would guarantee victory. He believed he held all the cards, but he was completely unaware that thousands of miles away, in a windowless basement in Hawaii, another war was being fought, a silent war of codes and whispers that was about to turn his perfect plan on its head. While Yamamoto assembled the greatest naval force in history, confident that the Americans were sailing blind into his perfectly laid trap, a different kind of war was being waged thousands of miles away. It was a war fought not with steel and explosives, but with ink, paper, and the crackling static of radio waves. It was fought in a windowless, soundproofed basement in Pearl Harbor, a place known to its occupants as the Dungeon. This was the home of Station HYPO, the U.S. Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, and its unconventional commander was a man who would become one of the unsung heroes of the Pacific War, Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was not a typical spit and polish officer. He was a brilliant, eccentric codebreaker who often worked in his smoking jacket and slippers, his mind a labyrinth of patterns and probabilities. For months, he and his team of cryptanalysts had been engaged in a painstaking battle of wits against the Japanese Navy's operational code, JN-25. It was grueling, mind-numbing work, like trying to piece together a shattered mirror in the dark, catching only fleeting glimpses of the enemy's intentions. By the spring of 1942, they were starting to see more than just glimpses. They were intercepting a storm of messages, all pointing to a massive new Japanese operation. Key words appeared again and again. A huge fleet gathering, an invasion force, and a mysterious objective designated only by the letters AF. The High Command in Washington was convinced AF was in the South Pacific, possibly Australia or even the U.S. West Coast. But Rochefort and his team felt it in their bones. It was Midway. They had seen A used as a designator for Hawaiian locations before. But intuition wasn't enough. They needed proof. What followed was a stroke of genius, a piece of spycraft worthy of a Hollywood film. Knowing that the Japanese often mirrored American communications, Rochefort arranged for the American garrison on Midway to send out an uncoded radio message, falsely reporting that their freshwater distillation plant was broken. They baited the hook and waited. A few days later, their patience was rewarded. A Japanese intelligence message was intercepted, dutifully reporting back to Tokyo, "AF is short on water." They had it. The proof was undeniable. Yamamoto's target was Midway. Armed with this bombshell, Rochefort's intelligence was relayed to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the calm, collected commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In a moment that would define the course of the war, Nimitz chose to trust the instincts of his codebreakers in the dungeon over the more cautious assessments from Washington. He began to gather his own battered, outnumbered forces, preparing to turn Yamamoto's trap back on him. The stunning American victory at the Battle of Midway in early June 1942, where 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers were sunk in the space of 5 minutes, was a direct result of this unseen battle of the minds. But victory, the Americans were about to learn, creates its own set of problems. The question was no longer if they could fight back, but how and where. And this is where the unseen battlefield shifted from the war against Japan to a war within the American High Command itself, a bitter, toxic rivalry between 2 of the most powerful and egotistical men in the U.S. military. In one corner was Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations. King was a brilliant but notoriously abrasive man, once described as someone who shaves with a blowtorch. He was a fierce advocate for the Navy and believed with every fibre of his being that the Pacific was a naval war, to be run by the Navy and won by the Navy. In the other corner was General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. MacArthur was a larger-than-life figure, a master of public relations with a flair for the dramatic. He saw the war through the lens of the army and his personal sacred vow to return to the Philippines. These 2 titans were locked in a ferocious struggle for control, for resources, for glory. They despised each other. After the victory at Midway, MacArthur saw his chance. He proposed a bold plan, an immediate, large-scale assault on the massive Japanese naval and air base at Rabaul, the linchpin of their power in the South Pacific. It was a sound plan, but to Admiral King, it was an unacceptable power grab. It would place his precious few aircraft carriers under MacArthur's overall command, something he would never allow. The argument reached a boiling point in Washington. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, desperate to maintain momentum against Japan, were forced to act as referees. Their solution was not one of strategic elegance, but of clumsy political compromise. They literally took a map of the Pacific and drew a line through the Solomon Islands. Everything east of the line was Admiral King's territory. Everything west was MacArthur's. King was given the first move. Phase 1 of the Allied counter-offensive. His objective was to seize the Santa Cruz Islands, the Japanese seaplane base on the small island of Tulagi, and what the initial order described merely as adjacent positions. One of those adjacent positions was a larger, jungle-choked island just across a narrow channel. At the time, it was just a spot on the map, a place with no known tactical or strategic value. Its name was Guadalcanal. It was meant to be a preliminary step, a sideshow before MacArthur's main event, but then, the unseen battlefield of intelligence delivered another jolt. On May 22nd, an American reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. A few weeks later, an Australian coast watcher, one of a network of brave planters and officials who hid behind enemy lines, reporting on Japanese movements, radioed that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield on the island's central plain. Suddenly, the spot on the map became the most dangerous place on Earth. An airfield on Guadalcanal was not a defensive outpost. It was a dagger pointed directly at the Allied lifeline to Australia. From there, Japanese bombers could sever the vital supply routes, isolating the continent and strangling the entire Allied war effort in the South Pacific. The timeline for a counterattack was no longer theoretical. It became a frantic race against the clock. The haphazardly planned Operation Pestilence, as it was grimly nicknamed by some, was given a new, more urgent codename, Operation Watchtower. The commanders on the ground were aghast. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, the newly appointed commander for the South Pacific, was convinced it was a foolish, premature move. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, tasked with leading the amphibious force, knew his men were undertrained and his ships were improperly loaded. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in command of the carrier task force, was still haunted by his losses at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was terrified of risking his carriers. They all knew it was a desperate gamble. A hastily assembled force was being thrown at an objective they knew almost nothing about, with flawed intelligence, insufficient supplies, and deep-seated divisions in the command structure. It was a mission born of a codebreaker's genius, a turf war between an admiral and a general, and a last-minute panic. The first American offensive of World War II was about to begin, not with a roar, but with a prayer. August 7th, 1942. Under a slate-grey dawn, the American armada slipped into the channel between the islands, a silent parade of grey ghosts against the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains. For the thousands of young Marines crowded on the decks, this was the moment. Most had never seen combat. They were about to become the spearhead of the first major American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War, nearly half a century before. The island itself, Guadalcanal, seemed to be holding its breath. Then the world exploded. At 6:13 a.m., the thunderous roar of naval guns from the cruisers and destroyers shattered the pre-dawn stillness. Shells screamed overhead, pounding the shoreline, sending plumes of fire and black smoke billowing into the sky. An oil dump erupted in a colossal fireball. For 2 hours, this barrage rained down, a steel curtain meant to obliterate any resistance. At 9 a.m., the ramps of the landing craft dropped, and the first wave of Marines splashed into the warm, murky water. They charged ashore, rifles held high, hearts pounding, braced for a storm of machine gun fire. But the storm never came. The beaches were empty. There was no resistance. The Japanese had vanished. The going was ridiculously easy. As the Marines pushed inland, they entered a scene of bizarre, frozen action. They found wooden barracks that had never been slept in. In one tent, a breakfast table was still laden with platters of meat, bowls of rice, and cooked plums. The food barely touched. Half-filled rice bowls and chopsticks were scattered about, dropped in a moment of panic. The Japanese hadn't prepared a defense. They had simply fled into the jungle at the sound of the bombardment. This was not a battle. It was a walkover. A sense of contempt began to brew among the troops. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine grumbled to a war correspondent. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, it was a fine war, but the officers were edgy. It was too quiet, too easy, but across the narrow body of water, known as Sea Lark Channel, a different war had begun. There was no deceptive calm here, only the jarring metallic scream of a gate to hell being thrown open. On the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the Marines ran headfirst into the true face of their enemy. Here, the defenders weren't construction laborers. They were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment, seasoned and dedicated fighters, and they were led by the toughest American troops in the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion. They were all volunteers. an elite force trained for the most brutal conditions. It was a clash of steel against stone. On Tulagi, the Japanese had dug themselves into the hillsides, creating a labyrinth of caves, dugouts, and machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. Every position had to be taken by inches, paid for in blood. Snipers, tied to the tops of palm trees, would let the lead Marines pass, only to open fire on the men behind them, sowing chaos and confusion. But it was more than just skillful tactics. The Marines encountered a spirit they had not been trained for, a philosophy of war that defied their Western understanding. The Japanese did not surrender. When cornered, they fought to the last man. In one dugout, after the Marines had blasted the entrance with dynamite, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who had only one loaded pistol among them. As the final assault began, the Marines heard 3 distinct shots. Inside, they found 3 bodies. One officer had shot his 2 comrades and then himself. This suicidal fanaticism was a shock. But what happened next forever changed the rules of engagement for the American soldiers. A few times, a wounded Japanese soldier would seem to signal his surrender, only to pull the pin on a hidden grenade as his would-be captors approached, killing himself and them in a final act of defiance. The lesson was learned in the most brutal way possible. Compassion was a liability, and mercy could be fatal. After these first encounters, the Marines took the Japanese on their own terms. Thereafter, there was virtually no further attempt to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. They were fighting an enemy who preferred death to dishonor and to survive. The Marines had to adopt a new, merciless calculus of war. The experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss on Tulagi became legendary, a perfect microcosm of the fighting. His men were pinned down by a machine gun in a cave. Moving up alone, Goss threw a hand grenade inside. He counted to 6, waiting for the blast, but the grenade was thrown back out. He tried again, holding it for 3 seconds before throwing. Again, it came flying back out. Infuriated, he called for a satchel charge, a bag of dynamite primed it, and shoved it into the cave entrance. The Japanese pushed it back out. The charge exploded, wounding Goss in the leg. Now, utterly enraged, Goss grabbed his submachine gun, charged into the cave, spraying fire, and single-handedly killed the remaining defenders. The fighting on the tiny connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo was even worse. The Marines landed tanks, only to see Japanese soldiers swarm them, jamming crowbars into the treads and trying to set them on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander killed 23 Japanese with his machine gun before one scrambled up the side and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. By the end of the second day, the islands were declared secure. The entire Japanese garrison of nearly 800 men had been wiped out. Only 3 were taken prisoner. The Marines had taken their objectives, but they were now different men than the ones who had nervously approached the beaches that morning. They had seen the true nature of the war they were in, and they had learned their first terrible lesson. In this conflict, there would be no quarter given, and none asked. But the true test was not on these bloody shores. It was forming in the skies above and, more ominously, in the dark waters to the north. The Japanese were surprised, but they were not broken. And they were coming back. As the Marines on the ground were learning their brutal lessons, the war in the air ignited. The Japanese reaction was swift. From their massive base at Rabaul, over 560 nautical miles away, waves of Betty bombers and their deadly escorts, the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, were scrambled. For the American pilots flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat from the decks of the carriers Saratoga, Enterprise and Wasp, this was their first major test against the legendary Zero. And it was a terrifying mismatch. The Zero was a marvel of engineering, faster, more maneuverable, and with a phenomenal rate of climb. In a classic dogfight, the Wildcat was a sitting duck. The Japanese pilots were masters of aerial combat, veterans of the war in China, confident and battle-hardened. They flew with an elegant precision, and they fully expected to sweep the clumsy American planes from the sky. But the American pilots had one crucial advantage. Their plane was built like a flying tank. The Wildcat could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and still keep flying, whereas the Zero, built for lightness and agility, had virtually no armor protection for the pilot or its fuel tanks. One good burst from the Wildcats. 50 caliber machine guns could turn a Zero into a flaming torch. Intelligence officers had drilled a new doctrine into the American pilots: never ever try to dogfight a Zero. Instead, they were to use teamwork and tactics that exploited the Wildcats' strengths. The most famous of these was the Thach Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach. 2 Wildcats would fly side by side. When a Zero got on the tail of one, they would turn towards each other. As the Zero followed its target in the turn, it would expose itself directly in front of the other Wildcat's guns. It was a deadly aerial dance, a way to turn a technical disadvantage into a tactical advantage. The skies over Guadalcanal became a chaotic swirl of tracers, smoke, and falling aircraft. The Americans lost planes. 21 of their 99 fighters were shot down in the first 2 days, but they gave as good as they got, especially against the less nimble bombers. They were holding the line, but the man in overall command of the carrier force was beginning to lose his nerve. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was a cautious man by nature, and his experiences in the war so far had only deepened that caution. At the Battle of the Coral Sea a few months prior, his flagship, the carrier USS Lexington, had been sunk under his command. He had been present at Midway, but it was Admirals Spruance and Halsey who garnered the glory. Fletcher was haunted by the spectre of losing another priceless aircraft carrier. He saw them not as weapons to be risked, but as precious assets to be preserved at all costs. Every report of a plane lost, every radio crackle announcing another wave of Japanese aircraft from Rabaul, every drop in his carrier's fuel gauges amplified his anxiety. He was operating in dangerous, submarine-infested waters, within range of a determined and powerful enemy airbase. In his mind, his primary mission to cover the landings was complete. The Marines were ashore. To linger any longer was to invite disaster. On the evening of August 8th, after just 2 days of operations, Fletcher made a fateful decision. He signaled Admiral Gormley, the overall commander far away in New Caledonia, requesting permission to withdraw his carriers, citing fuel concerns and excessive fighter losses. But he didn't wait for a reply. Under the cover of darkness, Task Force 61, the beating heart of the invasion's air cover, turned south and steamed away from Guadalcanal. Aboard his command ship, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the amphibious force commander, intercepted the dispatch. He was a hard-nosed, profane man known as Terrible Turner, and he reacted with incandescent rage. To abandon the transports, still only half unloaded, and the Marines on the beaches without any air protection was, in his eyes, an act of unforgivable desertion. The vast piles of ammunition, food, and supplies, choking the beaches, were a testament to how much work was left to be done. Without air cover, his ships were nothing but fat, helpless targets for the bombers from Rabaul. The entire operation was now in jeopardy. This decision remains one of the most controversial of the Pacific War. Was Fletcher a coward who abandoned his post? Or was he a prudent commander who rightly refused to risk America's last few carriers in the Pacific on a single, precarious operation, thus saving them for future, more decisive battles? The debate rages to this day. But while the American admirals argued, the Japanese were not idle. When the first news of the invasion had reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the newly formed 8th Fleet, had reacted with stunning speed. He was a specialist in night combat, a proponent of the long-lance torpedo, the most advanced naval weapon of its time. He quickly assembled a scratch force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. His plan was audacious and simple. He would sail his fleet down the slot, the narrow channel running through the Solomon Islands, under the cover of darkness. He would arrive at Guadalcanal after midnight, achieve total surprise, and annihilate the American and Australian warships protecting the transports. All day on August 8th, Mikawa's force steamed south. Incredibly, despite being spotted by an Australian patrol plane and an American submarine, a series of communication blunders, misinterpretations, and a general lack of urgency meant that the crucial intelligence never reached the Allied fleet commanders off Guadalcanal. The Australian pilot's report was delayed and dismissed as routine. The submarine commander's report was sent but not given the credence it deserved. The American command structure was a tangled mess. As dusk fell on August 8th, the Allied screening force of cruisers and destroyers took up their nightly patrol stations around Savo Island, the volcanic cone that stood guard at the entrance to the channel. The crews were exhausted after 2 days of constant alerts and action. A sense of complacency had set in. Their commanders, unaware of Fletcher's withdrawal and believing there was no credible surface threat, had not even formulated a proper battle plan. They were sailing in darkness, both literally and figuratively. They had no idea that a pack of wolves, led by one of Japan's most aggressive naval commanders, was bearing down on them at 26 knots, ready to deliver one of the most crushing defeats in the history of the United States Navy. As the last silhouettes of Admiral Fletcher's carriers vanished over the southern horizon, a profound and chilling silence fell over the waters of Guadalcanal. It was a silence felt more than heard. Aboard the transports, sailors and marines watched them go, and with them went the comforting roar of the Wildcat fighters. The sky, their shield for the past 48 hours, was now terrifyingly empty. On the island, the news spread like a virus through the ranks. They were alone. General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, received the news with the grim stoicism of a career soldier, but he understood the devastating implications. His men had secured a tenuous foothold on a hostile island, a tiny pocket of American territory surrounded by thousands of square miles of enemy-held jungle and sea, and their lifeline had just been severed. The situation on the beach was a logistical heart attack. Mountains of supplies were piled haphazardly, crates of ammunition stacked next to boxes of beans, medical supplies buried under tents. The beachhead was a chaotic mess, and the specialist shore parties needed to organize it were still on the transports. Now, with Fletcher gone, Admiral Turner had no choice. He could not risk his slow, vulnerable transports and their precious cargo under the threat of unopposed Japanese air attacks. He would continue unloading through the night as frantically as possible, but at dawn, he too would have to withdraw. For the 11,000 Marines ashore, the initial sense of an easy victory had completely evaporated. The brutal reality of Tulagi had taught them to respect their enemy. Now, the news of the carrier's departure taught them a new, colder lesson. They were expendable. The easy confidence of the first day gave way to a hardened, sullen resolve. They were no longer invaders. They were defenders of a tiny, isolated fortress. They began to dig in, their shovels scraping at the coral and earth, every shovelful a defiant gesture against the encroaching darkness. They now knew, with absolute certainty, that the Japanese would come back for them. They just didn't know it would be so soon. Out on the water, the Allied screening force settled into its night patrol. The ships were divided into 3 groups, covering the southern, northern, and eastern approaches to the transport area, all circling the ominous volcanic shape of Savo Island. But the chain of command was a mess. The overall commander, British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, was called away to a late-night conference with Admiral Turner, leaving no clear successor in tactical command of the scattered groups. The crews, utterly spent after 48 hours at general quarters, slumped at their posts. On the bridges of the American cruisers USS Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, the atmosphere was relaxed. Captains, assured by faulty intelligence that no Japanese surface ships were anywhere near, allowed half their crews to sleep. On the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, the gun crews were stood down, exhausted. They were sailing on a calm, tropical sea, under a moonless sky. It was a peaceful, quiet night. But they were not alone in the dark. Racing down the slot at nearly 30 knots, Admiral Mikawa's flagship, the heavy cruiser Chokai, led its column of wolves. They were a vision of lethal efficiency. Lookouts, specially trained and equipped with the best binoculars in the world, scanned the horizon. Float planes were launched ahead to scout the enemy's position and, if needed, drop flares to illuminate them. Every gun crew was at its station. Every torpedo tube was ready. Mikawa stood on his bridge, a silent predator closing in on an unsuspecting herd. Just after 1:30 a.m. on the morning of August 9th, a lookout on the Chokai screamed into his voice tube, Enemy ships sighted. Ahead of them, silhouetted against a faint glow in the sky from distant fires on the transports, were the cruisers and destroyers of the Southern Allied group. The trap was sprung. Mikawa gave the order he had been waiting for. All ships, attack. The night was about to be torn apart by the brilliant, terrifying flashes of naval gunfire and the deadly, silent wakes of long-lance torpedoes. The exhausted, complacent Allied sailors had no idea what was about to hit them. They were about to sail into the teeth of one of the most perfectly executed surprise attacks and one of the most lopsided and devastating naval defeats in the entire history of warfare. The question was no longer if disaster would strike, but how many of them would survive to see the dawn. Admiral Fletcher's decision to withdraw his carriers is still fiercely debated by historians today. Was it a prudent act of command that saved America's most vital assets for later battles like the Santa Marianas? Or was it an act of inexcusable cowardice that abandoned 11,000 Marines to their fate and led directly to the disaster that was about to unfold? What would you have done in his position? What do you think you would have felt as a Marine on that beach, watching your air cover disappear over the horizon? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is a debate with no easy answers. And if you want to witness the fiery chaos of what happened next, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. In our next episode, we will plunge into the night of fire and steel that was the Battle of Savo Island and see how the Iron Bottom Sound got its grim and tragic name. You won't want to miss it.